geographical patterns. And we're pleased to have Mr. Steve Jones of Enid, and a practicing attorney there who has moved along as a young lawyer in the field of civil liberties, has done a great deal of work there, has helped the university professors in one way or another, and who is a close student, in addition, of Oklahoma politics. In fact, he is doing a book at the present time, a research study on voting patterns in Oklahoma. We're just privileged to have you here this evening, Steve, and his topic this second hour will be voting patterns in Oklahoma. It's my privilege to introduce Mr. Stephen Jones. Steve?
Thank you. That introduction about the book, and tell you that soon on your bookshelves and bookstores will be Volume 1 of our book, which is Oklahoma Politics, 1907 to 1962. This book traces the development of the political history of the state and covers such things as the state senate, political history in the 1920s and 30s, and it has some 55 colored maps in it, many of which I will make reference to tonight. This particular book is subtitled The Democratic Era. The next one, covering the period 1962 to 1974, is entitled The Republican Period, and it will, of course, necessarily be shorter. And for those that just cannot wait to go to the bookstores, I happen to bring one or two copies with me tonight. Before beginning, I think I should tell you a little bit about my prejudices. In addition to being a person interested in civil liberties, I'm also a Republican. Some people find that a contradiction in terms in light of recent history, but I assure you that it isn't, even though a lot of the work of the American Civil Liberties Union has been devoted to prison reform. And I assure you that that's not necessarily related to the fact that I'm a Republican either. But nevertheless, just to give you this bias because of some of the things that I'm going to say tonight. In a discussion of Oklahoma political patterns, it's necessary to remember that the political patterns of this state were fixed as long ago as the Civil War. The three greatest influences were the Civil War, and even though the waters of 100 spring rains have washed away the blood of that conflict in the eastern part of the state, the impact of the war remains with us. The second was the pattern of settlement and the way in which Oklahoma Territory was opened, and the third, of course, was the Great Depression. Now, the patterns of Oklahoma have become so fixed that mere political organization, personality of candidates, or even temporary issues are insufficient to change them. It takes something such as a war, a major depression, a Supreme Court decision, or a mass movement of people to really perceptibly change the pattern of Oklahoma politics. And I'm going to suggest to you tonight, and I think I can prove my thesis, that there really isn't anything new in Oklahoma politics. And I'm going to suggest to you also that notwithstanding the influence of the metropolitan newspapers, that very few issues in Oklahoma politics are decided on the basis of conservatism versus liberalism, but are in fact decided on factors that go back much further than that. Now, I know in your course that you've undoubtedly discussed the development of Oklahoma Territory and Indian Territory, but nevertheless, at the sake of repetition, I'm going to discuss that again, and I brought with me some maps which I'm sorry probably are not large enough for everyone to see well. But you know that Oklahoma was originally two territories, incidentally the only state in the Union formed of two territories, and Oklahoma is the fifth youngest state, admitted 16 years after Utah and 4 years before New Mexico. The dividing line between the twin territories, which is the black line represented here, separated the 5 areas of the old civilized tribes, the Cherokees, the Creeks, the Choctaws, the Seminoles, and the Chickasaws, from their western lands, which they ceded to the United States shortly after after the Civil War. On the map here, you will notice that I have drawn in various diagonal lines. Those lines represent Oklahoma land that was open to settlement. The famous Cherokee Strip opening in September 1893 and the opening of central Oklahoma in April of 1889. Now, at the outset, it's important to remember that the 5 civilized tribes, for the most part, supported the Confederacy. All of the 5 civilized tribes had a large number of slaves in them. They had a slave culture, and they were all 5 represented in the Confederate Congress. And the last Civil War general to surrender was, of course, the commander of the Indian troops, General Stan Wadey. As a result of their participation in the Civil War on the side of the losing participants, certain Reconstruction measures were placed upon them. In addition to that, a small group of Cherokees to this very day in Adair and Cherokee County will be more Republican than the states of Vermont and New Hampshire used to be, simply because of the age-old antagonism against Andrew Jackson, a Democratic president that forced their families to move east or west, rather, to Oklahoma. In the western part of the state, the so-called Oklahoma Territory, the pattern of county voting is entirely related, as I will show you in a little bit, to the pattern of settlement. And I'll come back to that. Oklahoma, in any person running for public office, particularly a statewide election, must start out with 2 basic facts. First, 2/3 of the population of this state live east of Interstate 35, and that's placing Oklahoma City west of Interstate 35. If you draw a line from Tulsa south to the Red River, and from Oklahoma City north to the Kansas border and then south to the Red River, in that corridor between Oklahoma City and Tulsa will be approximately 75% of the voters of the state of Oklahoma. The second important line to remember is the South Canadian River, because the South Canadian River is the dividing line between the Republican strength and the Democratic strength. Also, it makes a lot of difference whether you're running in the primary or you're running in the general election. In the primary, if you're a Democrat seeking statewide office, the counties that will vote 60 to 70% are all south of the South Canadian River, the so-called Little Dixie area and the area in southwestern Oklahoma. The areas north of the South Canadian River will vote generally less than 50% in the Democratic primary. Unfortunately, that situation is just reversed in the general election. In the general election, the turnout in my part of the state, which is Enid and the Northwest, will reach astronomical proportions, 70 to 80%. And the turnout in Hugo and Durant and Idabel and Colgate and Ardmore and those areas will drop to 20 to 30 to 40%. So that even though those counties have far greater population than Cherokee or Blaine or Woods or Woodward or Garfield, nevertheless they won't vote as much. So we reach a parity with the Democrats. I say we, speaking as a Republican, we reach a parity with them. Now, the development of Oklahoma politics inside the Democratic Party, and I'm speaking now in terms of the governorship, because historically in Oklahoma, whoever controls the governorship controls the state Democratic Party. And that has been broken only once in the history of the state, and that was during the administration of J. Howard Edmondson. And of course, during the administration of the 2 Republican governors, the control of the party was nominally in the hands of the state chairman. But even as recent as last week, you'll notice that the man that was going to challenge Governor Boren's candidate for state chairman, State Representative Gary Payne, bowed out in favor of the governor's candidate, Senator Bob Funston. In the 1907 Democratic primary, in which Lee Cruz ran against Charles Haskell, the issue in that primary and the 2 succeeding primaries was the con-con versus the people that didn't participate in the Constitutional Convention. The con-con meaning those 99 Democratic delegates to the state Constitutional Convention at Guthrie. Out of that convention came 4 of the state's governors: Charles Haskell, Robert L. Williams, Alfalfa Bill Murray, and Henry S. Johnston. 2 of those were among the first governors of the state. But that formed a nucleus because that brought together for the first time in one place the leading figures across the state in both territories. Before, there had been meetings in Oklahoma Territory and perhaps meetings in Indian Territory, but this brought them together for both of the twin territories. Those people that went to the convention knew they had a political organization, and those people outside of the convention formed against those that had participated at Guthrie. After this initial period, the Democratic Party in the primary broke down to a cleavage between the so-called Bourbon Democrats, or the Chickasaw Democrats, or the Conservative Democrats, against the Populists. And I'm going to come back to that in a moment. After that, after World War I, the major element in the Democratic Party was the Farmer Labor Reconstruction League. And then from that, we went into the era of personalities where we had people like Alfalfa Bill Murray and Josh Lee and other noted persons. And then from that, we went into the area of the rural-urban split, which is still with us today. One thing that's very unusual about Oklahoma, and again, considering the fact that many people think we're a conservative state, it's particularly unusual, in fact striking, and that is that Oklahoma was for many years the #1 state of the Socialist Party in this country. The Socialist Party got its highest vote for president in 1912 in Oklahoma. It got its highest vote of any state in the country for governor in Oklahoma in 1914. At one time, there were 5 socialist members of the State House of Representatives, and there were some 200 to 300 elected socialist officials, from county superintendent of school to county commissioner, county sheriff, district attorney, and so forth across the state of Oklahoma. So great was the socialist movement that in western Oklahoma it literally controlled 3 counties. And in the southeast central part of the state, it was #2 in probably 10 to 15 counties. There was a very unusual dissimilarity between the socialists of the west and the socialists of the east. The socialists in the southeast were almost all tenant farmers. They were people very poor. They had to scratch out for a living. They were rebel rousers. They were revolutionists. The area of the so-called Green Corn Rebellion and the draft strikes of World War I. The farmers, however, and socialists in Cheyenne and Roger Mills County and Dewey County and that area out there were different. They were philosophical socialists. They were German socialists. They were socialists that believed that the basis of the Socialist Party was cooperation, helping one another, helping your neighbor. So in those areas of the state out there, it was the wealthiest precincts that voted socialist, whereas in the southeast portion of the state, it was the poorest precincts that voted socialist. Now, the socialist movement can be traced throughout the history of Oklahoma, and for many years it was the balance of power. The first territorial assembly of Oklahoma Territory, the balance of power was held by the Populist Party. And for probably the next 40 years, the balance of power was either held by the Populists or their successor. As you know, the Populists elected a delegate to Congress in 1896. After the admission of Oklahoma into the Union as a state, the Populists moved temporarily into the Democratic Party, but a large number of them formed the Socialist Party. And the Socialist Party became very strong, reaching the point that it received 20% of the vote in the governor's race in 1914. World War I killed the socialist movement in Oklahoma because a large number of socialists were Germans, or at least they were identified as Germans, and of course anything German or smacked of German during World War I was anathema not only to this state, but in many other areas in the Great Plains. So after World War I, those people that believed in the socialist principles met at Shawnee and formed the Farmer Labor Reconstruction League and supported Jack Walton for governor. And as you know, Walton became governor. And the rest is history. He was shortly thereafter removed, and Walton for the next 10 years became a very divisive force in Oklahoma politics. The socialists were now inside the Democratic Party. From there, they supported the candidacies of people like Bill Murray and E.W. Marlin, Gomer Smith, W.O. Coe, and so forth. And then finally, somewhere in the 40s, they sort of petered out as a political influence in the state. Now today, in any Democratic primary, at least since the mid-40s, the dominant issue has been urban versus rural. And I'm going to take just a moment to show you a couple of maps to point out that striking cleavage. In 1958, W.P. Bill Atkinson, who was the rural candidate for governor, carried all of the counties that have the stripes. Now you'll notice that there are some counties that have black dots in them. Those are the urban counties. Those are counties with population over 40,000. And you'll notice that Mr. Atkinson did not carry a single county where the population was over 40,000. But between 1958 and 1962, Mr. Atkinson learned more about Oklahoma politics. And among other things he learned was the growing urban power. So in 1962, when he ran for governor, he ran as the candidate of the urban bloc. This is W.P. Bill Atkinson in the runoff against Raymond Gary. You will now notice that whereas 4 years before, Atkinson did not carry a single county with a black dot in it, in 1962 he carried all of them but two. Those two being Ardmore, which is close to Raymond Gary's home, and the other one being Pottawatomie. Now, an overlay of this map will show that between those two elections, Bill Atkinson carried every county in the state of Oklahoma with the exception of 2 or 3. It's just that they changed between the two elections. Now, in 1958, a significant factor was the Prohibition. As you will recall, Senator George Muskowski of Oklahoma City ran on a platform of outright repeal of Prohibition, and J. Howard Edmondson ran on a platform of supporting an election for the repeal of Prohibition, but not having it at the same time as the general election. This is a map detailing the counties that in 1959 supported repeal of Prohibition. Again, you will notice that most of the urban counties supported repeal of Prohibition. In 1958, these are the counties that Muskowski or Edmondson carried, and where I mark second is a county where one or both of them came in second. Again, I know it's difficult to do out there, but if you will overlay these maps, and these maps incidentally are reproduced in the book, you'll notice a high correlation. The people that would vote to repeal Prohibition in 1959 voted for Edmondson or Muskowski in the 1958 Democratic primary. Now, V.O. Key, who was a prominent political scientist, noted a strange phenomenon in the 1968, or rather in the 1948 publication of his book Southern Politics in State and Nation. He found out that in the southern states, and Oklahoma is part of a southern state, in fact it was once said that if you married Mississippi and Kansas, you had Oklahoma, that is a striking phenomena here. And I can pinpoint it a little bit, and again the map isn't very good, in the 1958 Democratic primary. This is where J. Howard Edmondson lived. This is where he grew up. You will notice that all of the counties that he carried, with the exception of 1 or 2, were in his immediate neighborhood, the area where he had his greatest friends. This is George Muskowski's home in the area where he represented as state senator, and the counties that he carried were in that general area. Senator Reinhardt carried only 1 county, but that was his home county. But in the surrounding counties, he ran a very strong second or third. Bill Dunges, who lived up here and was an automobile dealer, only carried 4 counties, but 2 of them were right next to each other, and of course one of them was his home county. Then you have this strange collection of red counties across the state, and that represents the last hurrah of a man that almost came close to being elected governor twice, William O. Coe. William O. Coe was the last candidate of the old folks. For 20 or 25 years, the old folks were the dominant political force in Oklahoma politics. They got the passage of the sales tax to support the financing of old age assistance, and their first loves were Alfalfa Bill Murray, Gomer Smith, and William O. Coe, though not necessarily in that order. By 1958, however, the political coloration of the state had changed. But again, if you'll take a map showing those counties in the state of Oklahoma,
where 13.5% of the population was 65 years or over, and overlay it with the map showing the counties that W.O. Coe carried in 1958, again there'll be a high correlation of something like 90%. Now, occasionally in Oklahoma politics you have regionalism. That is, a particular candidate will appeal to a special area of the state. The closest example that I can find of that is the 1950 Democratic runoff between Murr and Coe. Now, this was the closest that Coe ever became the Democratic nominee for governor. In fact, some people have been so uncharitable as to say that Johnson Murray stole the election. Among those that said that was W.O. Coe. But you will note that Coe's counties are almost entirely in the eastern part of the state, and Murray's in the western part, and of course this heavy black line here is the dividing line between Oklahoma Territory and Indian Territory. So that almost 50 years after statehood, the cleavage between the west and the east is still very apparent. Incidentally, in 1954, when Coe ran against Gary, the results were almost identical with what you have here. On a lower level, you also find interesting tweezers. For example, this is the race that elected Carl Albert to Congress.
The little 3rd congressional district down here, Albert carried the blue counties, which are the hill counties for those familiar with southeastern Oklahoma, and a man named Steger, who lost his chance to go to Congress by less than 300 votes for the Little Giant and Little Dixie, carried the river counties, which start down here with McCurtain and go all the way over to Love County. Unfortunately, there were more people that lived in the 4 blue counties, or at least more that voted than there were in the some 8 or 9 that Steger carried, and so Albert went to Congress. To show you again a correlation, each one of these dots represents a labor union. Now, the dots down here are a continuation of Tulsa and Oklahoma County. So you see that the greatest concentration of union membership in the state, of course, is in Tulsa and Oklahoma counties, Canadian counties, Garfield, Kay, Ottawa, Okmulgee, Muskogee, and Washington County. Now, contrast that with this map, which is the diagram showing how state senators voted on right to work. Right to work meaning, of course, that they were opposed to the union shop. Those that were opposed to the union shop voted red. I'm sorry, those that were for the open shop voted red, and those that were against the open shop voted blue. And again, a high correlation between the two counties. Then if you take the 1964 election for right to work, these are the counties that opposed the removal of the union shop. These are the counties that favor the removal of the union shop. Again, a cleavage not only with the strong union counties voting in favor of the union shop, but also, again, the cleavage between Oklahoma Territory and Indian Territory. Now, what about the Republican Party? And the planning for a general election. In 1907, believe it or not, almost all of the blacks in the state of Oklahoma voted Republican, a factor the Democrats were soon to remedy by disenfranchising the blacks, which was upheld until it got to the Supreme Court of the United States. The brown counties are the counties that Frank France carried, who was from Enid, and he was the last territorial governor running against Charles Haskell. And then I've marked with a pencil here, also in brown, counties that he didn't carry, but he came very close to, like 49%, 49, 49, 48, 47, 46. These counties right here, from Creek over, are still the location of the dominant black population of the state. Shortly after this, the Democrats in the legislature disenfranchised the blacks by passage of the Grandfather Clause, and that was the last time those counties voted Republican. Now, contrast that with Henry Bellman versus W.P. Bill Atkinson. The blue are the counties that Henry Bellman carried, and the red are the counties that Atkinson carried. All of this follows a very neat, predictable pattern, except for this little county down here, which happens to be the home of Raymond Gary, and I'm sure you will understand why Henry Bellman carried that county in 1962. Now, in the general election, the pattern favoring or disfavoring the Republican Party or the Democratic Party is predictable. In Oklahoma, there are 3 things that count in November: agriculture, religion, and where your ancestors came from. Let me start first with agriculture. For years, it's no longer true, but certainly was true. In fact, until 1940, it's difficult for many people to remember that cotton was a bigger cash crop than wheat. And although cotton has been declining, historically it still has its political impact. This is a rough diagram, the green counties of the cotton counties in Oklahoma. Now, if you'll take Mr. Atkinson's counties, you'll immediately begin to notice that almost all of the counties that he carried were in the cotton belt. These are the wheat counties. Oops. That's right, wheat counties. Again, you'll notice that Henry Bellman received a significant support in the wheat area. In fact, he carried every wheat county in the state. Now, in 1957, the National Council of Churches took a religious population census and found that in the counties colored yellow, 60% of the people who had a religious preference were Baptists. In the same census, they found in these counties the majority of people that had a religious preference were either Methodists or disciples of Christ. These are the counties that Reuben Sparks, an Episcopalian, carried for governor in the general election in 1954 against Raymond Gary. You'll notice the only exceptions, or virtually the only exceptions, being the two counties in the east, which are Tulsa and Bartlesville, which of course are strong Republican counties. Now let's go back to the pattern of settlement. When Oklahoma Territory was opened, which was this little brown area here, the people that wanted to race for homes started at the starting line either here or here. Well, the people that started down here generally came from here, which means they came from Texas, which means they were Democrats, for the most part. The people that came up here came from the north, which means they came from Kansas or Iowa. So it was no surprise that in the first election for territorial delegates, the Republicans carried Payne, Logan, and Kingfisher, being the three northern counties settled by Kansans, and the Democrats carried Oklahoma, Canadian, and Cleveland, being, of course, the counties settled by the Texans. Now we get over here to the Cherokee Strip. The Cherokee Strip was the largest land opening, 6 million acres, and went over to this area right here, or approximately the Panhandle. Virtually the only people that raced for homes in the Cherokee Strip were people from Kansas, because it was just simply too long a trip and too fraught with difficulty for the Texans to come up here. But when the Cheyenne Arapaho lands were opened, most of the people that came were from Texas. There's a few Republicans that settled up here. And then, of course, when the big pasture was opened, they were practically all from Texas or Arkansas, and this area is heavily Democratic. And then, of course, Greer County, which we got by an order of the Supreme Court, was originally Texas anyway and was Democratic, and so they just moved over here. Now, how does that explain what happened in the eastern part of Oklahoma? Well, as you know, the eastern part of Oklahoma, or Indian Territory, was settled to the Indians. Well, those Indians that voted, with the exception of some Cherokees that I've mentioned, had a natural tendency to vote for the Democratic Party because they supported the South during during the Civil War. But there was another thing that happened. The whites kept slipping over across into the Indian Territory. But the whites that moved over, with the exception of those very few up in Missouri and Kansas, came from Arkansas or from Texas. So they brought their Democratic tradition with them, and that accounts for why this area of the state today is overwhelmingly Democratic. There is a high predictability in the election. For the Republican Party to win in Oklahoma in a general election statewide, it has to carry all of the traditional Republican counties in the northwestern part of the state, which is an area from Beaver County over to Ponce City and south as far as Guthrie, by over 60% of the vote. Indeed, some of those counties they will carry by 70 to 75% of the vote. They must then drop down and carry the marginal Republican counties, which generally start about here and go down like this, by between 55 to 60%. They then must carry most, if not all, of the marginal Democratic counties, which are those counties that settle right on the South Canadian River, by 50 to 51% of the vote. And then they must get approximately 38% of the vote in the southern part of the state. That leaves Oklahoma and Tulsa County, and they need over 60% in Tulsa County and over 55% in Oklahoma County. Now, occasionally there can be an exception, but not very often. You have some Republicans that win by a substantial margin. The classic example, other than Richard Nixon, who carried every county in the state, was W.B. Pine, who ran against Jack Walton in 1924. Pine carried all the counties in red. Incidentally, that was the same year Oklahoma was voting for a Democrat for president, John W. Davis. In the 1968 presidential election, and I'm sorry this one isn't colored in, Hubert Humphrey carried those counties in which an H appears. Wallace carried 2 counties, Pushmataha and Atoka. But a more typical Republican pattern for a losing candidate is Pat Patterson, who ran against Fred Harris in 1966 as a Republican nominee. And he carried, as you can see, even carried Oklahoma and Tulsa counties, but he didn't carry them by enough votes. He almost made it, but not enough. Now, if I may, I'd like to say a couple of things about the 19... Incidentally, this is a sort of an interesting map. The closest the Republicans ever came to electing a governor prior to Henry Bellman was when they ran Joe O. Ferguson in 1950. Senator Ferguson lost, not Phil Ferguson, but Joe Ferguson. He was a newspaper publisher from Pawnee, incidentally still alive. He lost by 16,000 votes. This is a correlation between his race and Henry Bellman's race. All of the counties that are colored with a variation of red, that is to say yellow, orange, or the stripe, show increases in the Republican vote. The greatest increase is coming with the bars, which is over a 25% gain, which is not too much, a few down here, and of course Cimarron County. But the greatest Republican gains, of course, coming in the West in excess of 10%. But in the East, the Republicans actually lost support in 1962 over 1950. This is one that I'm always interested in. When Dewey Bartlett ran for governor in 1970, when he ran for re-election, there were 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. There were 14 counties, I forgot one I noticed, that he did not carry when he ran for re-election. And that's the reason he lost, because if you notice the location of those counties, they are the key strategic counties. They are the marginal Republican and marginal Democratic counties. Just a few hundred votes shifted. There are not many votes in those counties, but they're symptomatic of the trend. Now, I'd like to spend just a second or two before entertaining questions, if there are any, explaining what happened to Clem McSpadden. If you had told anybody, particularly someone from the New York Times, that Oklahoma would elect a stout 33-year-old Rhodes Scholar as governor rather than a cowboy who had a ranch and whose last name was Rogers and whose first name was Clem, and he was a popular congressman, and he was a rodeo caller and part Indian and related to Will Rogers, they would have said that you suffered from being exposed to the Oklahoma sun. But in fact, Boren had a number of very important assets, most of which he kept cleverly disguised from the public, so that he could portray the image as an underdog, which incidentally was one of his greatest strengths, because Oklahoma generally votes for the underdog. It has been said that if Clem McSpadden had had the election the day he announced for governor, he would have won. And indeed that's true. That's why so often we Republicans win elections in the summer and lose them in the fall. But he was at his strongest the day he announced for governor. Boren had at least 5 factors in his favor. 1, geography. He came from the corridor between Oklahoma County and Tulsa County, in fact, the precise center, Seminole. So he was well enough known in the immediate area where most of the votes were. Number 2, he early identified himself as the urban candidate, not because he said I'm the urban candidate, but because Clem McSpadden's name was Clem McSpadden. And in South Tulsa, they don't vote for you if your first name is Clem. In addition to that, he kept reminding people that he was a ranch hand that he had a radio caller, and he never talked to Raymond Gary, who would have told him that's the last thing you want to do in an Oklahoma Democratic primary. Number 3, Boren had the image of a reformer. And that's very important in Oklahoma, because notwithstanding the tradition of Oklahoma as a conservative state, we elect a large number of reformers. Finally, Boren had organization. Well, McSpadden had organization too, but I submit to you Boren's was better. And finally, and most important, something that very few political commentators know, Boren was young. It is not unusual for Oklahoma to elect young people to office. J. Howard Edmondson was elected governor when he was only 33. George Nye was barely of age to be lieutenant governor. Jed Johnson was elected to the House of Representatives before he was even constitutionally of age. Fred Harris was barely of age to be a United States Senator. And throughout the history of Oklahoma, young people, and I mean really young people, below the age of 35 have been elected to major statewide offices. So Boren was not the one that started the trend. Indeed, he was the beneficiary of the trend. And finally, one other thing happened. Clem McSpadden must surely have never realized he ran at the same time the horses did. Now, the horses carried northeastern Oklahoma, which is where McSpadden was from. But that's the only area they carried. And the people that got out and really voted to kill the horse racing issue were the Baptists. And David Boren, who is not a Baptist, but who teaches at Oklahoma Baptist University, was the beneficiary of that. And finally, Clem McSpadden was the front runner, that very unenviable position, as Raymond Gary can tell you many hours about. And finally, you can say, well, what about the incumbent governor? And my answer is, what about him? In Oklahoma, prior to the election of Dewey Bartlett and Henry Bellman to the United States Senate, only 2 former governors have been elected to statewide office. Jack Walton finally made it to the Corporation Commission in 1932 after losing every other state race he could run for, practically. And the only other ex-governor to ever make a political success in Oklahoma, the only one, was Robert S. Kerr. So when David Hall announced that he was running for re-election, he might as well have been talking to the wind, which in fact he was. Now, interestingly enough, again, you'll see the area of geography. If I'll show you the counties McSpadden carried in the runoff. Again, up here, the friends and neighbors were the people that supported it. But unfortunately, he didn't have enough friends and neighbors. Well, I will stop now so that if there are any questions, I'll be glad to try to answer them if I can. Historically, of course, the governor was limited to 1 term, so it was a lame duck when he came in. That was the first disadvantage. The second disadvantage is that Oklahoma had a high degree of factionalism, which meant that people supported a particular candidate. But after that candidate gets elected, and particularly after he's a lame duck, then they sort of gravitate to others. They've got poor old Henry elected governor now, but now they want to know what they're going to do 4 years from now. So they start gravitating to somebody new. A United States senator's not like that. He's able to be reelected, and so he has to constantly keep his machine or his organization together. Another thing, of course, that hurts governors is the fact that governors have to make, decisions that are very difficult. It's just like Carl Hagen used to say from Arizona. Never give a speech. You can always explain a vote, but you can't explain a speech. But governors have to speak and take a lot of action. And at least until recently, state government was the thing closest to them. Finally, I dare say that a lot of it had to do with the people we elected governor. By and large, while we've had some giants, and it's a trend of Oklahoma that we have weak governors, at least for a long time we had weak governors followed by strong governors. We had Haskell, who was very strong, followed by Lee Cruz, who's very weak. Bob Williams was strong. J.B.A. Robertson was weak. So weak he was indicted. Then we had Jack Walton, who was impeached because he was too strong. And the next election we put in Henry Johnson, who was impeached because he was too weak. And then you finally had Alfalfa Bill Murray, who was strong, Marlin, who was weak, and then you had Phillips, Kerr, Turner, who were all strong, and Johnston Murray was weak. And Raymond Gary was strong. So a lot has to do with the personality of the governor. Recently, of course, governors throughout the country have had difficulty even managing to be reelected just simply because of the rising tax burdens. So those are some of the factors. Again, Boren may be the one to change that. Although I really doubt it. I really doubt it. Yeah.